So, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, and good night to all those listeners. We want to welcome you to our first launch episode of the Gentleman Standard. Our whole focus here is defining gentleman as a intentional and disciplined and self-aware concept. Our goal is to provide guidance rooted really in standards and not really trends or opinions. This is why we deem this important. The podcast exists really to help men show up fully formed in a world that judges really, really fast. Our overall supporting thoughts that we have as to why we deem this to be important is the world tends to make decisions, I would say, quickly. And standards can help you control the first narrative. That's the intention around why we deemed it important to start this conversation and future conversations that we'll have on topics relating to establishing and setting a standard, and invited guests that'll have conversations relative to that as well. I am joined by my esteemed co-host, Yor-el who
Indeed.
will give you a different concept and thought. I'm here representing the corporate boardroom concept within that space, and he has a different take, a different path, and different journey. So I'll kick it over to him to talk a little bit more about why he's a part of the establishment of the Gentleman Standard.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Cecil. This is pretty exciting for me because it's sort of been the theme of my life in a way. When I was 13, I got a book from my grandparents called The Young Gentleman's Guide to Life. And that sort of was my inspiration for joining this because it always set a standard for me as to how I execute my life, so to speak. And as we were talking, full disclosure, we're related, we're cousins, and we kind of grew up together. And we traded stories on how that sort of background and legacy has shaped who we are as men today, and how that resource that we have from the life that we lived could be shared with others. Hence, now, where we are with launching this Gentleman Standard to reach out to those who may want to partake in our knowledge of what we think is essential for a gentleman to navigate through life.
Amazing. One of the things that we'll do, and just kind of backing that up, is talking about our legacy. You already approached that subject. One, that we come from mixed blood. From that standpoint, a family lineage that has really helped to define us through our process. So I know one of the things that you deemed as important was to establish a legacy, considering that you are the more creative of the two of us, being coming from and managing and crushing it in the entertainment industry. I'll kick it over to you to just kind of talk about legacy and presence, which is one of the key things around setting a strong standard.
So for me, I take legacy very seriously. We are both Liberian born, and there was a time when that meant something. And there was a time when that carried a weight that was essential in the world of African diaspora. And as we grew up, we saw that carried out in our daily lives with our parents and our grandparents, uncles and aunts, and the way they carried themselves, the pride they had. And that's the first, I think, layer of legacy. We've talked about how we've seen our parents, our family members just show up every day. No questions asked, no grumbling, no reason other than showing up. And as kids, that sort of it resonates with you. And you sometimes don't even know that it does, but when you become an adult and you're doing the same thing, you understand how it resonated with you and how that was an imprint that your family lay unbeknowingly as a foundation for you to survive and thrive in this modern world. So that's one of the anchors of legacy. The other anchor are the immediate connections, my mom and my dad. As I mentioned, I'm from Liberia, which is a country in West Africa that was founded, so almost nearly 200 some years ago by freed men and women who came from the Americas and landed on the West African shores. My ancestry is so varied, it's not even funny.
Yeah.
But my dad was born in Trinidad of Haitian and Barbadian descent. And my mother was born in Liberia of Barbadian and Virginian, U.S. Virginian descent. So it's kind of like this really mixed ball.
Full circle.
Yeah. And I have a little story about my great grandmother who was born in, she said, the Gulf of Guinea. She wasn't specific at the time, the countries weren't specific, but she was born there and taken, kidnapped when she was a teenager and taken to the New World with her sisters. And Africa never left her. And when my father was born, she kind of told him stories of Africa and where she grew up and how she was and her family. And that resonated with him. And just on a whim, he was an engineering student. He decided to apply to an engineering course in Liberia where they were looking for engineers to build roads and construct new facilities to build up the country. And he got in, he applied and he got in, and that was his gateway to Africa from the Caribbean. And that's a legacy I carry with pride.
Amazing. Relative to when I first heard that story, just kind of thinking through how the blueprint has been laid out for us and how, from an international perspective and just a global perspective, how these things interconnect to build us up. I am, as Yor-el referenced, I am also Liberian born from that standpoint. So I understand international flair, for lack of a better word. When I look at the different DNA that made me up who I am, what has really moved me through industry and professional and personal accomplishments and challenges along the way. My father, uh, originally from Jamaica, immigrated to Liberia with his family, started off a thriving business within that sector, coming up from our grandfather who was looking at opportunity overseas and took that leap to go through that process. His father as well. And you're going to see that in our project that we pull together, that it really tells our story. My mother, who was born in Liberia, her father, our joint grandfather, is a diplomat who's been involved in really weighty things, moving the government along, influencing international relations, et cetera, across the world. I say that to say, before I ever really understood what to be a man, I was given examples, and really not through words, but through presence, right? And that's when you think about, and what we're trying to accomplish with the gentleman's standard is establishing some pull through thread for those that listen. The young men, the young professionals, and older professionals and men that are trying to get some insight, some thought, and some others that may be going through things in our way on a day to day that can provide you some type of inspiration. We don't do this through words, but through presence, as I said, through discipline and consistency. That's how we experienced. I know Yor-el and I was really what we experienced from these individuals was how they carried themselves when no one was watching. We got to see that.
Mhm.
These men, my grandfathers, my father, they didn't just talk about standards, they lived them. And that was the thing that really resonated with me. They showed me how you present yourself. It is a reflection of what you believe about yourself. The integrity isn't just situational, right? As you go through that process, the respect that we saw looking from the entrepreneurial perspective, diplomat-based perspective, was a reflection of what they believed. And the integrity that we've gone through, I said, is not situational, it's earned in small moments as you go through that process, and is how I live day to day. The thing that really hit me was that your name means something and you're protective of your name. It should mean something when you're not even in the room. When
Absolutely.
you're seeing it, you're going to see it in the family photos that I pulled through from that standpoint. This is the blueprint. The standard is passed down, refined, not replaced from that standpoint. Standards aren't to be followed. We've said this for through our prior engagements. They're set, and they're set by you, and the blueprint that's established for you. That's what I've experienced, and that's what really has led me to want to be able to give back the things that I've experienced along those lines, and hopefully help others as they're building their blueprint as well.
And I think that's the key is passing on what we've learned and how we learned what we learned. And you said it best. They showed up and were who they were when people weren't watching. And I think that's key, I think, to what we're doing. It's not a beat your chest type thing. It's a, methodical. This is who we are and this is it. It's unvarnished. We're not trying to be anything other than who you are and who I am. And when we talk about standards, I think sometimes people get confused with standards being this high, the epitome of everything. It's like standards are different and standards vary. And I think that's one of the most important ways to frame the conversation. With their standards, as we've talked about before, there's standards for certain things, there's standards for certain rooms. You don't show up every place. It's a wave as opposed to this set box or cube that you have to fit in. It's more like you can kind of curve around it. And I think for me, that's important to address in our conversation as we talk about standards and grooming towards greatness.
Yeah. When you start thinking about that, that's a foundation. I loved when we started thinking about how, what our topic would be. A baseline foundation around grooming is something that we're going to delve into even more. The big thing here, when you start going down that path, is the thing I've learned early on is talent opens doors. And I've heard this from a mentor a long time ago. Talent opens doors, but polish determines how long you're trusted and how long you remain in said room. And that's been key to me throughout my career. So point well taken and point well made. So let me ask you, people may be asking as they're going that this is our first episode from this standpoint. Why you two? Why would this partnership work on providing insight within this space?
I think it works because we're two different personalities from two different avenues of professionalism and approaching standards, however, in the same way. And it again goes back to what I just hearkened to before. In the standards I'm trying to frame it. I work in television and film, and you work in banking. However, we both aspire to achieve greatness in our various professions or chosen professions. The way I go about going to a meeting, the way you go about going to a meeting, the process and preparation is the same. However, the outcome not necessarily is the same. I'm in a t-shirt, you're in a jacket. Those are our standards. It's not a one or the other. And I think that's, for me, important to parlay. That's why I think it works. Our dichotomy. We are related, but we come and approach things very differently, but have the same sort of pathway. And I hope people understand that.
Yeah, what struck me when we were talking about this and thinking about the opportunity that we're looking to bring to the table for those that we thought needed to hear it, there is a lot out there as relates to being loud, being an alpha male, boisterous, right? The loudest in the room and establishing your dominance within a particular space. The way we wanted to come about this is listen, what gets you far in industry? Because here's the deal. We may be in different rooms, but we have the same standard. And that is discipline in the corporate space and entertainment space as relates to presence. We know that you have to have a due diligence around the way that you move and operate to be successful. It is a challenge not only for us as global inspired individuals that have come through, nationally inspired individuals that have come through, but across all different ethnicities that are pulled in play. This is not a white thing, black thing, Hispanic thing, Asian thing, etc. This is something where if you have the right mindset, the right due diligence, and the right discipline, you can go far as long as you're consistently thinking about how you build your brand and work through that process. And that's what we're going to look to tackle with, minds across different industries as well. So it's kind of explaining the convergence around the two worlds. It's really different room, same standard. We are intentional in our brand and how we move through those spaces, and it's helped us be successful. And you talked about grooming and reframing the grooming concept, which is really a core philosophy around where you build. And it's funny because people don't think of that. It's kind of the easiest things people think about. I've been in front of rooms as an example where I've had to have conversations around brand etiquette with new hires within that space. I've done offsites with individuals to kind of think about shopping with a plan. It's one of the things I've been in banking for over 30 years. I've also worked in the fashion industry, owned a modeling agency years ago, and I run a styling company called Benedict Society. Ultimately, what we've talked about is really building your brand, weaponizing that brand to assist you in negotiating, for lack of a better word. And the number one thing that gets missed within those spaces is everybody wants to be themselves, which I don't have an issue with. Let me put it that way, which is amazing. You have to be yourself. There's some element of that of building yourself up and trusting and believing. But I got to tell you,
Let me just
there was a
interject. Get the job first, then be yourself. But back to you.
the big thing here is when you think about it, you have to think about this in a way of, I've said this recently, which is we always show up really well when we interview. Every day post the interview, is another interview. You wake up every day as though you're going into an interview, you will always be your best self. Whatever version that may be, there's a core of who you are that you don't want to run away from your blueprint and the things that are established, but you're interviewing every single day. And if you approach it that way, I promise you the grooming and the foundation and grooming towards greatness will be something that is automatic relative to your process on how you set your day up. So I love the fact that we're going to kind of get into that in
Yeah,
more detail.
absolutely. And I think that's one of the things I admire about you is that that's your core philosophy, which is you approach every day, regardless of whether you're going to the tennis court or you're going to the office, as preparation. And I think that's very important. And that again comes from foundation. You're not doing that just by accident.
Mhm.
It's by design, and it's core. And that's one of the things that I think is important for us to underscore over and over again as we continue this conversation.
It's I think about our grandfather's feedback to us. And one of the things, and I'm sure you heard this as well, before anybody knows your value, they experience your growth.
Mm.
And it can be the most distracting thing in conversation. When I've had to hire through the process and I've kind of think through teams or I show up in meetings, etc., your grooming can be the most distracting thing to get your point across if you don't think about it that way. Imagine sitting across the table from somebody who has something in their teeth, right? As simple as that. And how often are we sitting across from somebody and we are embarrassed to articulate to them, listen, there is something in your teeth that literally I need to tell you about, but I don't know you well enough. Am I going to be bold enough to tell you? Some of us are, others aren't. And it has distracted you from everything that they're saying. That's your grooming on a day-to-day basis as you're going through the process. If you haven't taken the seriousness of how you show up from a brand-based perspective, you will find out at the wrong time when you get in a mirror inevitably after you've been in a particular meeting and having a conversation. How come no one told me I had this going on? And now you have completely everything you deflated relative to where you've gone, whether you thought it was great or what have you. Your grooming is that process. How you wake up and how you establish yourself establishes your day. You have to be meticulous around how you polish that process.
I
In
think,
my humble opinion.
no, I agree. I think that in this modern world, especially today, we've sort of lost the understanding of interpersonal communication and how grooming is a part of interpersonal communication. So
Mhm.
your grooming greets before you open your mouth, right? Um, since the pandemic and because of, Zooms and people are in meetings, digitally and that sort of thing, people have sort of strayed from understanding that interpersonal communication and contact requires certain protocols if we're talking about in a professional setting. And I think sometimes people lose sight of that with the overly casual world we live in right now. And I think that's definitely something we should address and will address as we continue our podcast.
Well, and one thing, just for those who are listening to us through this process, because it's a slippery slope when you start talking about grooming, right? And everybody has a different belief system, et cetera. We're not talking about grooming for the sake of vanity,
No.
right? What we're talking about grooming is the equivalence of self-respect made visible in a nutshell. It's the first signal of seriousness of engaging and interacting, right? Your first impression precedes your character assessment, so you go through the process. And the way I think about it, quite frankly, and the way I approach my day to day, and it's funny because you know how people usually with me. I didn't know you own jeans. I didn't know you own shorts. They think I'm in suits all day long. I'm not, right? The way I approach my day is, and it's the weirdest thing, but I had a mentor do this with me, especially when I was going in the fashion industry. And by the way, the reason I'm in the fashion industry, have been in the fashion industry or some shape, form, or fashion, dating all the way back to college, is my mother. My mother has a sense of style that once you see it and you get it and you understand how she approaches her day to day, is
Mhm.
bar none within our culture, with where we are. It's just the way that she was brought up. The way I approach my day is I wake up every morning and I exit myself. And what I mean by that is I look at a second version of me that I'm going to manage throughout the day. So as I'm getting myself together and getting dressed, I am building me up as the day goes along. And I literally am looking along the lines of the day as though I have a robot with me, a robot version of myself that I've dressed, that I make sure I'm assessing throughout the day. I'm asking for feedback from others around the ways that I perform. I'm asking for feedback on the ways that I showed up. I'm getting that type of, but I'm also looking on the outside of my overall shell, my brand for the day, and assessing throughout the day. whether it be in the morning or how I've gotten to this is right, this is appropriate, this is the level I've established during the day as I'm going through my day, and post as I'm assessing how that day went each and every day. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I have a strategy around how I'm going to build myself professionally and how I show up in certain rooms. That's the way I approach it. And it's a level of self-respect relative to my brand on the points that you made.
And I on the other extreme, I actually think about my week. I don't do the day-to-day,
Mhm.
assessment, but I do the weekly assessment where I just look at, the challenges ahead and what I need to achieve for the week and what I can get away with not achieving. So it's like a weights and balance thing for me, which is planning and scheduling, and that's how you get through life. You think ahead, you troubleshoot, work out the kinks, and execute. So similar, just a little varied.
So, so building on that, when we first started talking about this, you talked about the book that was allocated to you at an early age, right? The Young Gentleman's Guide
13.
through the process. And I know grooming goes across life stages. But as you kind of think about that, you're making standards relatable across all age groups as we're kind of going through that process. I'd love for you to talk about when we may have some individuals that are in high school or early career, things that they need to think about, you getting your 20s and 30s, your 50s, because it changes relative to how you process and how you go. What are your thoughts, or what feedback would you give to those that are early career, high school age, et cetera, around grooming?
I think the number one thing is have a standard for grooming, meaning, shower, brush your teeth. Some people don't use deodorant, but that works, in the room that you're in. So figure out what works in that room. And if no deodorant works, then hey, go for it. It's like basics. I think when you're young, it's the basics. I think that as you get into the corporate world, I think it's about understanding the culture of where you're going or where you are. Let's say you're at the start of your career and you're beginning the interviewing process. I think that's where you have to, especially in today's world, figure out where you want to be. That's number one. Two, where
Okay.
you think you'll fit, and three, a place that'll have you. And then in all that aspect, you need to do the research of if you're interviewing, where that company is, what the company culture is, whether they're jeans and sneakers or, broad stripes. And it's amazing how people just don't do that, just due diligence, which is a small step in the information age that we're in, where we're inundated with information about places. And so that would be the first step. If you're going to a company, you need to know what their standards are. Are they relaxed? Are they okay with, unkempt hair? The list could go on. Can you just walk around, just not showering every day? That's important.
How have you, when your experiences within the entertainment industry, how has grooming impacted in a negative way individuals that have shown up for opportunities that you've seen without giving any names?
Of course.
I'm not trying to put anybody on blast
No,
within
no,
that
no. I
space.
mean, that's not what we're about. I think that let's take the entertainment.
Hmm.
It's a more relaxed environment. So nobody's going around groom checking.
Hmm.
However, I did have an instance where someone showed up and they were in what one would describe as like club wear. So not comfortable clothes, like maybe leather pants and like, uncomfortable shoes. And the nature of the job is running around all day. So you can wear that and that's fine. But you'll be hot as hell and uncomfortable, and your body will hate you a few years from now for that. So that's the flip side to it. It's also about being practical. You can walk around with overgrown toenails and then, socks start bursting, and then you're like, oh, so there are two sides to every story. So
Sure.
that for me, it's the practicality of grooming, the practicality of just understanding that you need to do just some due diligence on yourself,
Mhm.
what you present to the world. Because again, as you say, you are a brand, and whatever that brand is, you need to present it as best as you can.
Yeah, I'll my thought has always been your grooming should evolve as your responsibility evolves, as you're kinda going through that process, right? The standards are relatable, like I said earlier, across age groups. So I look at it this way, and the feedback I would give, and as you're thinking about career in the corporate environment or entrepreneurial space, and we talk about different rooms, same standards. So I'll build on what you talked about. Hygiene's important, right? Awareness of it, the basics of it. There are individuals from a family background perspective where simple things like deodorant are not things that you maybe an Americanized Western civilization-wise standpoint. It's not something you do. And the general deodorant process and things along those lines, the chemicals associated, I know there's some concerns for others that go through that process, to
And
each his own.
religious as
The
well.
challenges.
Some people have
Exactly.
there's a
Religious belief.
gamut of things.
But what you also need to be aware of is when you're in certain spaces and you're working through things and you're really thinking about your brand, is you've got to figure out ways to offset within that particular space, right? And hygiene can be a detractor as you're sitting in a room and individuals are like, What's that? What's that process? The more you're detracting from what you're trying to do or deflecting from your overall message and mission, you are pulling yourself back more than you're moving forward, right? So think about that as you're going through your process. Offset that. What is the solve or solution? If from a simple as deodorant, as you're going through that process, if you are not putting deodorant, what are you doing to ensure that there's not some type of fragrance that's following you along the lines through that process, and not to begrudge anyone through that as you're kind of thinking about how you care for that. You have to have a plan, awareness around the basics, right? Learn early that showing up matters and it will have an impact within the places that you go. And that's in the high school and early career stage as you're going through that. It's nothing as simple as that. When you're in your 20s and 30s, consistency over trend, especially in the corporate environment, we are very trend minded, right? And your folks are trying to show up spending way too much money on the ways that their brand needs to go through, from that standpoint, the different routines. You need to be consistent. You need to be disciplined around the things that you do that are focused around your grooming. We'll talk about that in a second. But consistency matters versus trend, whether it's a new skincare routine and you haven't even figured out how to make sure that the basics are cared for, it is a detractor. And you look in your 20s and 30s around grooming, fit grooming routines, intentionality is something you should think about, right? It's how you shop, shopping with a plan through the process and the ways that you weaponize and ensure that your overall brand and the cover that is your grooming is cared for. Your 40s and 50s, it's refinement, it's restraint, it's authority, right? Grooming as a leadership presence is the way I look at it. As I got older in my career, it is a non-negotiable on the ways that I pull. Your grooming should evolve as your responsibility evolves through the process. Get the basics right, and I promise you, you will build a really sustainable brand through the years.
And I think the key to that is having a plan, and
Yes.
having because I think that it's sort of like having a plan, understanding where you are in your career and understanding the patterns, the culture, just, all the mores of wherever it is your workspace is, I think helps you navigate that world better. And so then you can sort of tailor your grooming to that. And if you're
Yeah.
the type of person who's not into, you know, grooming, then you then understand how to navigate that space and what the bare minimums are. And that
Hmm.
helps you get across the threshold because some people just are not equipped to just be, groomed all the time. I get it. But it helps you along the way having a plan, knowing what your office culture is, what people accept, what the minimum is, what the maximum is,
Hmm.
and being able to navigate that space as opposed to just having no plan and showing up willy nilly.
Yeah, it's funny. Your brand, which is what you're going to build, like we can't do it for you. All right. From that standpoint, your appearance is the first promise you make. Period. I got that from a mentor years ago. Your appearance is the first promise you make. Keep it. And I've had a chance to echo that with mentees that I have, that I meet with regularly. Another thing that I've lived by is if your grooming is sloppy, people assume your thinking is too. Basically, so I'm talking hopefully to the to our younger gentlemen that are really wanting some insight and feedback around like how should I show up? What are some things that are important? If your grooming is sloppy, people assume your thinking is too. Meaning, I'm not trusting you with money. I'm not trusting you with a gig. I'm not trusting you with a deal. I'm not trusting you with the opportunity. I'm not trusting you with this role because you're showing me who you are because that's what I'm experiencing before I even talk to you. And
Mhm.
more times than not, when you enter a room, you are being judged before you get a chance to talk with a person that you want to talk to. It's important through that process. When we talk about practical no excuse standards, you and I got into this in a little rapid fire. From that standpoint, I'll get into some things and you tell me what your thoughts are. So the first thing is it from a overall appearance-based perspective, because that's the core of it, right? Is how are you showing up? The immediate actions that are tied in with how you show up in your personal grooming habits that are going to be your foundation of everything else you need before you put clothes on. Let me put it that way. Your hair, is it maintained? Isn't it? Are you intentional about it? If it's wild and willy-nilly, what room are you trying to get into, and what impression are you trying to make from that standpoint? I'm not trying to tell people how to do their hair and things along those lines. I don't have that problem from that standpoint. I make sure this is cared for, right? But how are you wanting to show up and being purposeful about that? People notice that. Your facial hair, how is it shaped? Are you shaved? If you've grown it out, how does that look? Based off of where you want to go, what you're trying to negotiate, what you're trying to work through. Your clothing, which is the cover that you pull and play for the grooming, fit over cost, folks. I will tell you, you can spend $4,000 on a suit and show up in a room and look sloppy, disheveled, etc., without the intention. You can spend under $100 for a suit through a process in the corporate environment and have the right matching and have the right fit and show up way better because your grooming and everything is situated, and your appearance and the feel that you have exudes through to our conversations. Your shoes, make sure they're always clean. It's your process. It is your responsibility, always clean, to make sure that's occurring. And your scent, this was something I learned early on through the process. For those young gentlemen that are getting into the cologne state, which Yor-el is going to talk about in a second, make sure it's subtle. Please don't have people smelling you from when you get off the elevator or enter the room to when you sit down. I learned that early on, that I was that guy where you could exit an elevator and know that I had been in that elevator probably an hour ago, meaning I sprayed way too much on. From that standpoint, you have to be smart and diligent around how you show up or not in certain spaces. So those are my rapid fire standards I've established. What's your take on that?
I have to confess, I'm still that guy. Well, fail for me there.
Okay.
But I think the point you made about fit over cost is so important, because
Mhm.
I think when people talk about grooming, hygiene, standards, again, I think the conversation leads people to think cost, high maintenance, things that exceed budgets, and that's not what we're about. I
Mm-mm.
think understanding that you can go to a thrift shop, you can go, yeah, to Goodwill, like just wherever, and still show up and be a gentleman and have your standard and be groomed and be all of those things without any sort of meant to, your own standards. And I think that people often get caught in that trap where they think if it's not a designer, or if they're not paying X amount or Y amount, it's not worth it, or it's not going to bring them up. And I think for us, I'm so glad you brought it up, because it's a point to nail home: fit over cost. Costs should not exceed what you can afford. That is
Right.
not that a gentleman doesn't overdo his budget. He lives within his means.
Yeah, no, it's one of the things I did. I said early on, I've done numerous offsites, and especially with the ones that are most impactful is when I've done them for a group of guys that are really trying to understand, how do I shop? Shopping with a plan. What do I need to know about fabrics? Right, designers that are here. What do I need to spend? What makes sense from a budgetary based perspective? I'm like, what budget do you need to work within? And it's the simplest question that really is tough for folks to answer, because they're more focused around how they show up to others than how they're going to feel comfortable in the room. If you're overspending, and thank you for bringing that point, gentlemen do not spend beyond their means and don't have a plan for their money and their families and their legacies. That's a part about being a gentleman, right? Every day you're strategizing. When I said I had something, another person that I'm managing throughout the day, which is Cecil, as I'm going through that process, I'm thinking about all those things as I'm working that stuff through. It also goes into how I'm weaponizing my closet. I shop with a plan and a strategy, the things that I'm solving for. You talked about a week planning. I do that with my fits that I do throughout the day. And I try to make
Mhm.
sure things show up in a way that when they get on my body, it enhances my self-esteem as I go through that process. I feel great about myself in every room I enter into. I got that DNA from my grandfathers. As we're kind of going through that process, they showed up in rooms and didn't care from that standpoint, around the fact that in many of these instances, they're the only African in that room. They didn't diminish their self-esteem through that process. Sure.
And that
Go ahead.
that harkens back to what we talked about, standards being self-imposed. It's like I it's the panacea. It's like if you are not imposing, if you're not doing your methodical thoughts, your checks, if I'm not doing my weekly checks, that's my standard. That's self-imposed. That's how I get to being better.
Mhm.
That's how I get to self-fulfillment. That's how I get to being a person with high self-esteem. All those things check off from having a self-imposed standard.
Mhm.
And it's like, it's just sort of encapsulates everything we're talking about from just that one kernel of you taking responsibility for yourself as opposed to others taking responsibility for you.
The way that I think about this is if you don't respect yourself enough to the point you're making, if you don't respect yourself enough to be groomed, don't be surprised when the world follows your lead. In a nutshell, plain and simple, you have to have a strategy. You have to have a plan around how you're going to show up and how you feel when you step in certain rooms. So there's
Mhm.
a process that goes along with that. And here's the deal: we said this early as we're going through this process. This gentleman's standard conversation. One, we are doing this to ensure that we're giving back as we've gone through our learned experiences through this process to others that need to hear this type of messaging or are willing to internalize it to hopefully help their strategy. We're not doing this in a judgment zone, right? But there's no coddling that we're doing as well. What I've always learned is growth requires discomfort. And when we started talking about standards, my big thing here is standards are literally self-imposed. You brought that up earlier, and grooming is respect. Period. Grooming is respect for yourself and for others. That needs to be something that you have nailed before you can move on to the other things that come around establishing your gentleman to standard. Forgive me.
Yeah, I think it's, as you said, we're not beating our chest, but collectively, we've got several decades of experience as men who've navigated uh, the corporate world, who've navigated our various professions, who have achieved a modicum of success. And I think that that experience alone is worth having a conversation of how we did it, how we're doing it, and how we intend to continue to do it. And I am a firm believer that it goes back to my having standards and your having standards, and those standards having been imposed on us unwittingly as children growing up and, guiding us through our teenage years and into adulthood to where we are now. So standards for me are very important.
The big feedback I'd give on this topic that we got into today of grooming, we're going to have a lot more discussion on things like grooming and more on establishing and curating and being stewards of your personal brand and your standards that are tied in is what's your routine and really taking some self-reflection around, do I have a routine that I strategize against for the week and looking at your week in that way. Well, what's my overall routine around grooming? What's my overall routine around how I'm going to show up, the things that I'm leveraging to show up in a certain way, and what's my plan and strategy for the week to ensure that the standard is set and people see it in that way, right? I will say the big thing here when you and I were talking about this effort that really stuck out to me as we're going through this. This isn't about being better than the next man. We talked about the alpha male concept that's going on right now, that you've got to dominate the room and you've got to be loud and boisterous, which is not working in many instances because the folks that are telling you that more times than not have established a certain thing that works for them. It's not going to work for everybody. I promise you, it doesn't show up the same for each. But what does is due diligence, right? And what does is consistency. It isn't about being better than the next person. It's about being a better version of yourself, period. That you can do on a day-to-day basis. That's establishing a set standard and living by it and just getting better. That's why
Absolutely.
being a part of this is important to me.
Yeah, and consistency is key. Showing up is key. And understanding that it's okay to take care of yourself. It's okay to plan things for yourself. It's okay to groom yourself. It's okay to sit down and contemplate where you're going to be a week, 5 years, 10 days, fill in the blanks. Those things are part of growth. And those things, at least for me, visualizing, as you explained early on how you sit down, that's basically you're visualizing your life out. And that is a powerful tool. And the funny thing about that is that's the beginning of grooming, because if you're visualizing what you're gonna see, it's you're pre-planning the steps. You know what I mean? It's like and then you take that visualization and you execute it with whatever suit it is or t-shirt or how are you gonna shave or, cut your hair, etcetera. And I think that is important because it's like that's your blueprint, that's your plan for who you are.
Yeah.
As you said, you're managing Cecil. That's your plan for Cecil.
Mhm.
And you should have a plan, speaking to you, the listener, for yourself.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say that just encapsulate everything that we've just talked about is before anybody knows your values, which we all imagine ourselves talking with somebody and them being in awe of us and what we bring to the table. But before they can get to that point, they experience your grooming. And you can really lose modicums of trust if you approach that in a sloppy manner, right? And not just pure sloppiness for the sake of sloppiness. It's just that you don't have a plan and you're freewheeling it. You end up in places that you don't want to be relative to how you want your brand represented. That's on you. That's on you, quite frankly. Self respect.
Moral of the story, have a plan. That is the gentleman's standard.
That is the gentleman's standard. So, what's coming next? We are going to have topics that range. We're going to have guests on from within the entertainment industry, within the corporate environment, leaders of industry, entrepreneurs, etc., who will bring insights around what they feel to be the gentleman's standard and what's important to them, their experiences, or how they engage. We think it's topics that will provide a lot of value back to the listeners and audience. Topics that get into personal brand, reputation, relationships, presence, money discipline and restraint, corporate and creative navigation, mentorship, fatherhood, legacy, race, perspective, and power. Those are all topics we're going to get into. And we want to ensure that we're providing value for our listeners and also reacting to feedback you may give and insights along the way. This is a journey together that we think is important for us to take. And hopefully we learn things along the way. I'm going to be learning quite a lot, engaging with Yor-el and others that come in as well. So I'm looking to learn as a mentee to the process. Yor-el, what you want to impart and what's coming next?
I think the most important thing is for you to understand that the gentleman's standard is not a cookie cutter thing. It's you taking what I'm saying, what Cecil is saying, and what other guests may say, and then kerneling out what works for your life. And I think that for me is success because I think that's how we navigated our worlds. That's how we are where we are. And I think that's what we would like to impart to you, the audience.
Yeah, the couple of things to take away, right? Listen, we talk about why this works between the two of us. We didn't stumble into the polish. We were taught that excellence travels, right? And what we mean by that is I talked about leaders that we've engaged with and men of standards that ensure that whatever room they went into, their self-esteem and their standard was set. So they had a floor that they established themselves on that was elevated and it was based off of being better than they were the day before. Like I said before, talent opens doors, but polish determines how long you're trusted and for how far you're trusted within that space. And it determines how long you'll stay in that space. That's what
Right.
this is going to look to impart to you. This podcast exists to help men show up fully formed, like I said, in a world that judges fast, really fast. So making decisions quickly on the standards that are set to be established in a floor that makes sense will help you control the first narrative. And that's our goal. That is ultimately our goal. And that, for me, is a gentleman's standard.
Absolutely. So we want to thank you for listening and watching, and we hope you tune in to our next episode of The Gentleman's Standard.
A great one.
Cheers.